Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Real Solutions podcast. We are a podcast series put on together by the Othering and Belonging Institute, where we are discussing real policy solutions to real policy problems. Now, if you've joined us throughout the entire series, you may be recognizing some of the faces that are joining us here today. We are joined today by a bunch of our speakers throughout the series, and now this episode is trying to put the threads together. Over the last couple of episodes, you heard us talk and do deep dives on around certain policy issues, whether it was baby bonds, to the wealth tax, to social housing, to community crisis response programs. And now we're all here together to try to figure out, well, what is this vision that we are hoping to achieve as we move forward into this new world? And what are the policies that are going to help us champion this new vision? And with that, I want to introduce our speakers so you get a sense of who's in the room with us. We are joined by Amit Khanduri from the Georgia Resilience and Opportunity Fund, Cindy Black from Frick's Democracy First, Ivan Luevanos-Elms from Local Progress, Moira Birss from Climate and Community Institute, Michelle Perin from Willamette Valley Crisis Care, and Tony Samara from Right to the City Alliance. I hope you're all doing well, and thank you for joining us for this finale episode of the Real Solutions podcast series. So, Eli, do you want to start grounding us and jump into the conversation?
Yeah, hi everybody. I'm Eli Moore, co-host. Excited to bring together these conversations into one. And just want to set a little bit of context because the world is on fire, right? But we still want to advance real solutions. And so what kind of sense we're making of this moment and what sort of openings it creates and what openings it closes off is important for, shared strategies and analysis. And there's so much going on, especially as it relates to policy and government, right? We see the Trump regime just trying to destroy whole cloth big parts of the federal government, cutting more than $1 trillion from Medicare and then giving more than $1 trillion in tax breaks to wealthy individuals and corporations, and actually eliminating around 10% of the federal workforce. And then just blatant violation of norms that have been widely accepted, like due process, with the vice president claiming that ICE agents seen murdering Renee Good have absolute immunity. So major shifts and challenges to the norms. And then we can also think about how new institutions are being built out, because ICE used to be a very small federal institution. It actually didn't exist until not too many years ago. And now its budget has been increased 8-fold so that it's larger than all other justice agencies combined. But it's not all bad, because the type of resistance and solidarity that we're seeing is historic. The levels of block-to-block direct action, cutting off support for ICE, shutting down the local economy in certain places, and then historic lows in the approval rating of the president. And now we're leading up into the midterm elections. So we're not partisan here, but we can also recognize that there are going to be campaigns from all parties and angles. And so then the question is, what policy proposals will candidates be running on? Are they going to run on a narrative that says, I'll take us back to normal, let's just, end this chaos and get back to normal? Or are they going to run on, what we would call real solutions, an agenda that really doesn't try to go backward, but tries to go forward towards a set of policies that would really address people's real life problems? So I think there's opportunity in this moment, but I wanted to kick us off with that question for our speakers. What are the challenges and opportunities that you see right now, given this political moment? Have you seen new support, new needs on the ground, or other openings? And if there are any policy developments specifically that have happened in the last few months? Let's kick it off with Ivan. Can you share your thoughts on that?
Yes, and thank you all for having me back. Always love being in space with y'all. There's no sugarcoating it. The moment we are in is distracting, and it's destroying communities. Our folks, represent cities, counties, school districts. They are on the front lines. They're literally face to face in some instances with ICE agents, CBP agents, and putting their bodies on the line to protect their communities. And the deployment in Minnesota, specifically in the Twin Cities, is unprecedented. They started at 3,000 agents on the ground. Meanwhile, the police department of Minneapolis is around, like, I think, a little over 600. And so what they are doing is creating chaos, not safety. And so whether it is following the deployments in Illinois, California, and Oregon, there is now a mood with folks, whether they are part of the immigrant rights movement, whether they are not, or everyday people, that they see what ICE and DHS is doing to communities, which is destroying them and disrupting them. And in these moments of defense, in these moments where our folks are stepping up, there's opportunities, even in these dark moments, for moving the needle on various issue areas. One of them is the ICE deployments are causing people to not be able to work, not be able to pay their rent. So how can we bring back eviction moratoriums, which are a practice we learned especially during the pandemic, where people's economic standing was directly impacted? How can we make sure we keep them in their homes? That is no longer just a harm mitigation, that is safety. We need to allow people to stay in their homes. So whether it is our amazing member, Robin Wansley, sponsoring a bill to introduce eviction moratorium in the city of Minneapolis, or whether it is members from Minneapolis and St. Paul and across the state asking the governor and the state legislature to implement this. These are practices that have worked, and we've seen definitely work during the pandemic, and are needed right now in such an emergency situation. Another thing is that we're coming out with our No Secret Police Toolkit, which is a toolkit that is grounded in our Constitution, which is grounded in our civil liberties. What are steps that localities, in partnership sometimes with states, can implement to protect their communities? Two examples from that toolkit is ensuring that our schools are safe, ensuring that they don't have to share any data, that there's an extra layer of protection of students, of parents, of teachers. Our school board members are in the front lines, and in some instances have been caught up in the chaos that has been brought to elementary schools, middle schools, high schools. We saw the story of Liam Ramos getting snatched up by these horrible people. And what can we do to stop that? And one of them is making sure that we are able to cut that flow of information that is causing harm. The other one is one of the wonkiest and nerdiest things, the procurement process, contracting. What are current contracts that we have in place as cities, as counties, as school districts that are contributing to the deportation pipeline? How can we cut those off? But also, how can we use the procurement process to hold corporate institutions accountable for their role in this situation? And all these things are proactive measures that ensure that our money is not going to further damage our communities. So how can we make sure that procurement process, how can we make sure that our school districts, and how can we make sure that our folks can stay in their homes? These are all basic things and are also opportunities to demonstrate when we say we keep our community safe, we show it. It's not centered around an ICE agent. It's not centered around police. It's actually centered around everyday people stepping up. So I do want to uplift that our members have been in deep collaboration with organizations like Take Action Minnesota, Copal, Unidos Minnesota, in knowing what role they can play, knowing what role they can complement, but knowing that we all right now have to be stepping up. And some of those policies have been done in the past and are needed to come back. And some of these policies we have to test because they are grounded in the protection of our civil liberties, in our privacy, and in the Constitution.
And a lot of those measures are really, they seem like really urgent and strategic protections. And I'm curious, like, what are some of the game-changing proposals for policies that would move us even further as far as like community well-being? And I'm curious, Moira, your work on disaster insurance with the anniversary of the LA fire, that's been a big part of the public conversation. How have you seen that playing out in this moment?
As Ivan was already laying out, this is an extremely difficult political moment at the federal level. And among the many awful things already named, in the space that I work around disasters and disaster recovery, we also have the administration preventing disaster relief funds and even disaster mitigation and prevention funds from going to states, right? So it's happening in this area too. And home insurance policy is a unique area because due to longstanding federal law, insurance regulatory policy actually happens at the state level pretty much entirely. The federal government has very limited role. So we actually have some really unique opportunities for state level action, even in this really tough federal environment. So for example, states can directly impose regulations on insurance companies to cap their profits or to force them to improve their treatment of policyholders, of consumers. And states could also be setting up public insurance programs, right? That could look like a public option, or that could look like a single payer disaster insurance program for households. And states also have a lot of power to increase the resilience of housing in the face of disasters, from zoning laws and building codes that keep new housing out of the riskiest places and shore up housing when it does get built, to, of course, grants and direct investment programs in resilience measures. And while states don't, of course, have the same spending power as the federal government, they do have the power to impose taxes and fees on corporations. So they can look to polluters and the companies with the most at stake to help pay for this, like the fossil fuel industry, the most responsible for all these disasters getting worse. And mortgage lenders are also a key player in this housing question. And we are seeing some exciting developments even today in this area. So for example, in places as different as Georgia and California, we have progressive politicians who are running for the top insurance regulator job, with the California candidate saying she wants to pursue disaster insurance for all. So there are some hopeful signs, particularly at these more state and local levels.
That's great to hear. I sort of see this picture in my head of the federal government just kind of pulling back from the states and leaving these huge gaps. That then the question is, what's the new system that can fill those gaps? Even though there's such harm being done, it does create some opening. Tony, how are you seeing this question of the changing political context from right to the city's perspective?
Yeah, thanks, Eli. I guess maybe I want to step back a little bit. We've been thinking a lot about what it takes to move good policy in this climate. And I guess I'll start by saying I think there are kind of two big threats facing us right now. The first is that authoritarianism wins, that we fail to prevent it, that it consolidates, and that we spend the next decade or more trying to dig out from under it. And we know enough about authoritarianism in history, both here and elsewhere, to know that we want to avoid this threat becoming real at all costs. And that's kind of all I want to say about that threat, because that outcome forecloses the possibility of real solutions. It closes the political space for them. And, one of the reasons we talk about real solutions is because we believe they can help us avoid that fate. We see them as speaking in a real way to real needs, real suffering at a time when people are fed up with what's been served up by both parties for too long. But it goes deeper. The exhaustion people feel is not just with the political parties, it's with all, or at least most of the institutions that shape daily life and against which most of us feel powerless. So political institutions, yes, but also media, health, culture, and of course, economic institutions. And so the reasoning goes, if we offer real solutions, we can create political momentum that is less dark, less nihilistic than surrendering to authoritarianism. And that political momentum, anchored by real solutions, will sweep people along with it like a wave into a better future. And maybe we're right. But that takes us, I think, to the second threat, which I referred to in my remarks in the first episode, and Eli, which you actually also referred to in your opening remarks. And that's that we allow ourselves to underestimate the weariness with the world as it was, and let ourselves slip into old ways, that we put our energy implicitly and explicitly into rehabilitating and reviving those institutions. And given where we are now, it's hard not to look upon them with some level of nostalgia. Surely they were better than where we are now and where we may end up, right? Who wouldn't trade what we face now for 2015 or 2008 or 1998. But the reality is many of us, or many people, would not take that trade. Many would and have said, I don't know where all this leads, but what is there to lose? I'll take my chances. And that's not just a voice from the right, although they may be organizing those voices better right now. But I think we'll find some version of that voice almost anywhere we look. But that is both the threat and the opportunity that we face. So while real solutions are a necessary weapon in this fight, they're not sufficient if we misunderstand the times and the mood. So to be very concrete, my fear is that if the Democrats retake some level of power, they'll attempt some sort of reset to 2016, that they'll mistake the growing resistance to authoritarianism as a call to return to some imagined, better, more sane, more stable past, that they'll employ some version of a rhetoric of real solutions, but then fail to deliver. And I fear that because I think that would make an authoritarian future much more likely. And so I don't think it's controversial to say that we don't want to count on them. If we the people, the progressives, the left, are going to move these real solutions, both in the immediate and over the long term, we need to understand the politics of the moment are scrambled in ways that make them hard to read. Some have referred to this as a process of de-alignment, right, where taken for granted political associations can't be taken for granted anymore. And so that's the challenge. Can we make enough sense of the moment to move with unity, with clarity, and with vision? And can we do that at a scale that counterbalances both the forces of authoritarianism and the forces of establishmentarianism? These, I think, are the kinds of questions that we want to put front and center if we're going to realign politics and people around our vision and around these real solutions, whether we're talking about eviction moratoriums and states of emergency in places like Minneapolis and St. Paul, or the longer term solutions, for example, that right to the city around housing that we fight for: social housing, permanently affordable, democratically controlled housing. To make that possible, we really need to understand the moment that we're in.
So I think, to just reiterate Moira's point, this is already a good conversation. I want to to move us into the second question that I think already, Tony, you have started talking about. And this is looking again at some of the narratives and the messages that are very much resonating at this time. And just kind of a little bit of what I'm hearing, I think, Tony, what you're talking about is this notion of reimagining a new world that we're thinking and moving towards, right? Like, there is an opportunity to fall into the complacency of previous systems and the way that they have benefited many people. And at the same time, I think, to Ivan's point, right, you're now having a lot of folks who are on the ground and eyes are opening. Y es como de que, amiga, ¿cómo te apoyo? I could have told you this a long time ago, pero welcome to the fight. Welcome, baby, because we need you now more than ever. And I think, Moira, you also position us in a very interesting place, because I think talking about insurances and letting us know that insurances, a lot of the times, those policies and regulatory policies are at the state level. To your point, Tony, that separation somewhat of power, right, between states' rights and federal rights, which is at the core of like the constitutional crisis we're about to embark on. But just saying, it gives us an opportunity to think about how we reimagine this world at different scales. Right? Like, so what are the things that we can test in a state like California, like Minnesota, that other states can learn from? What does it look like in Washington? What does it look like in Oregon, and vice versa? And I think that's the to your point, Tony, the what we're talking about, scalability. It's not going to be cookie cutter for every state. And I think there is some of that fun challenge of realizing, what can we do? So I'm curious to hear from other folks as well. So again, what are the narratives and messages that are resonating for the case for policy proposals? And at the same time, what do we do when when white nationalist populists take some of these proposals, pervert them in some ways, and be like, girl, here it is, messaging Trump accounts. So I'm looking at you, and thinking about baby bonds.
Yeah, happy to step in here. And again, thanks for having me. Good to be with this group. As I think folks have been alluding to a little bit earlier, is that there's, a broad recognition, I think, across voters of many persuasions, many political persuasions, that the economy is just not delivering for working class people, right? So I think it's broadly recognized that wealth is concentrated amongst a select few, that hard work and doing the right thing is just not enough to prosper or get ahead. And I think that shared frustration really does create real openness to structural solutions, especially as those that are addressing wealth or not just providing short-term relief. And so this also means that though when politicians are adapting, as you say, sort of a perverted version of a real solution, it means we ought to really hold the overturn window open without legitimizing the knockoff solution. So for example, let's look at Trump accounts or 538 accounts. So instead of treating Trump accounts or 538 accounts as a step in the right direction, which I think some folks are doing, we ought to recognize that the core idea is still broadly popular, that children do need meaningful assets when they reach adulthood to have a fair shot at prosperity. That is a broadly popular notion in this moment. But instead of saying this is a step in the right direction, we ought to really just impose a pretty simple test. And it's that if a policy is not meaningfully advancing a just economy, it's not a real solution. So in the case of Trump accounts or 538 accounts, we ought to be clear that something like this is actually going to disproportionately benefit those that are already wealthy and exacerbate wealth inequality. And so this policy proposal is really one that fails on its own sort of stated terms, the terms that the administration has stated. And we ought to be relentless in our pursuit of real solutions and also do some future building, as I think Tony was alluding to earlier. So we ought to offer alternative solutions that can help us to build towards a new economy that works for everybody instead of rehabilitating institutions or pursuing solutions that haven't worked. So for example, we're seeing baby bonds legislation being introduced in over 15 states, red, purple, blue, otherwise. And baby bonds is a solution that is intended to get at the root of the problem of wealth inequality, which is simply just the lack of wealth itself. It is telling and hopeful and encouraging that state treasurers and politicians in red and blue states are recognizing, right, that wealth inequality is a real problem, that there ought to be a root cause solution, and that wealth inequality is something that's impacting young folks, whether they're in a rural community or an urban community or suburban community at this point, that the future is looking a little bit, the economic future for young people is looking a little bit bleak. So this is becoming clear to folks across the aisle. And so it is encouraging that in the case of something like baby bonds, despite what's happening at the federal level and the noise around Trump accounts, that state treasurers and other politicians are pursuing sort of a more inequality reducing solution. And maybe the last thing I'll say on this is one thing we have to do a better job of is articulating very clearly how these solutions that we're proposing give folks a real shot at prosperity. You know, whether you're in rural Georgia or in Atlanta, at this point, we do need these solutions that address that address the root of the problem, and in doing so, will then create the foundation for a just economy that works for everybody.
Thank you so much for that. It's so funny you said that, and I was like, I was being triggered and reminded that in your episode, I was like, oh, we're talking about bridging, right? Like there is a shared value that we can bridge across some political divides, because we have weaponized, in my opinion, identity politics to a folly, and now we are where we are. But it's so funny because you said that. I was like, I remember saying something along the lines of like, yes, the analysis for why baby bonds are needed can be rooted in racial disparities, and also part of the messaging is ensuring that we talk about multiracial benefits and cross-class benefit, right? I'm curious, Michelle and Cindy, any other messages, narratives that you feel are very persistent in this moment of time?
I think for me, when I listen to, thank you for this conversation, it's great. It reminds me, especially being, a crisis worker, that everybody is in crisis right now. Like every system is in crisis right now. When we kind of look at like the government at, kind of on a macro level is in crisis. And then all communities are, in various levels of crisis right now. And then community members at a micro level, like there's so much crisis. And kind of looking at historically building up, community responders or mobile crisis teams from, the murder of George Floyd in 2020, like we're at this place now, 6 years later, still trying to like push forward, like what we were asking for based in that situation, in that scenario, in a very different, like complex added component scenario where it's like it just feels like we're kind of trying to build the crib while the house is on fire. It's just this really interesting narrative where being a field worker, it's like, okay, we still need to continue to work on that narrative that like community response, mobile, community-based responders, alternative response to traditional systems like policing, getting away from the carceral systems is still the important narrative, while we're watching, so many things fall apart, so much money, be taken away from these systems that were part of the safety nets, that like everyone's like, well, all we have left is what's fast and familiar, right? And the fast and familiar is not what we want to go back to. We are like, but that is what, in a crisis, people try to go back to the lowest level of like what solution they can create. So it's how do we create spaciousness within a crisis itself to say, what are our common values and vision? Because a lot of, everyone is in crisis. Like when I look, the police are in crisis, the, community members are in crisis, the healthcare system is in crisis. Like every day it feels like, do I really want to look at the headlines today? Because it's one more thing that we're getting stripped of, of these places of dignity, these places of like human-centered care. Like they're all going to, these robotic, conglomerates and, and I'm just like, wow, this is this really real life? But realizing that like, yes, we have to just keep moving forward with, what are the things that we're doing like right now with, like my program within this city to like get an actual community responder team back out on the ground. And how are we participating in the larger narrative so that like, as we build out these teams, these disciplines, like that we're not forgetting where we came from, the good parts of where we came from, right? So that we're not just holding on to like, okay, let's figure out what the Band-Aid is right now. Let's figure out like, what's fast and familiar. Like that's carceral logic, right? Fix it, make it go away. And I'm like, we just need to pause and say, fix it and make it go away. A, doesn't work, and B, is incredibly harmful.
Some folks don't know this, but I'm also trained as a social worker. So as much as I love policy, I'm always like, but what is the behavior? So I love talking to Michelle. I'm curious to hear, Michelle, because I do believe that something in crisis response and emergency management, we really go back to like the very sort of biology of who we are as organisms and how we respond to one another. What do you think are some of the conditions that you're seeing happening in crisis response programs? And Moira, maybe this might be true in the work that you're doing as folks are responding, but what does that kind of feel like? What does that look like? What are those conditions that are really allow for folks to bridge across and be in solidarity in time of crisis?
I mean, I think one of the biggest things that I'm seeing right now is the unification of organizations that are doing this work. Like where, yes, historically we've been pitted against each other. There's the scarcity mindset. We're all fighting for that piece of the pie. I'm seeing a lot more where we're like, we're not doing that. Like, we don't have to do that. There's space for all of us. And then holding, cities and, counties and states and the federal government responsible for saying, no, we don't just want to like throw a little pilot money at this thing and hope that it'll fix this larger thing. We need to look at it as a kind of a crisis continuum. So I'm seeing a lot of incredible collaboration where we're figuring out like, how can we do more with less, but still do more? Which I think is really, really incredible to be part of, and not to be, infighting each other because we were all put in the ring together and told that, and then they threw something at us and we're just like, yeah, no, we're going to fight. We're not going to accept that narrative anymore.
I work in the democracy space, and I'll just say, if we had a functioning democracy, we wouldn't be here right now. The problem is that our pillars that are supposed to hold up democracy are very weak and have been for a long time. And this is one reason why we're in this space, and we can't get all these policies passed that everyone here is working on, because we don't have a functioning democracy. And we need to address things about elections and voting, how we vote. The money issue is huge. The money that gets dumped into politics, into campaigns, because people want certain people to be elected so, they can get a return on their investment, and it leaves average people out of the mix altogether. And I really believe it's time for us to look at, going back to something Tony said, is about what do we want this to look like when all of this comes crumbling down? Because it will come crumbling down at some point. There's no way it can continue to go like this. There's going to be a lot of damage in the wake, but it will come crumbling down. And what kind of system do we want on the other side that enables access to the ballot? Right now we're seeing, even talk about nationalizing elections. These bills that are introduced in Congress, the newest one, the Make Elections Great Again, that's not what that's about. It's about keeping people from the ballot, keeping people away from being able to have their voices heard, controlling elections, continuing to pump up lies that there's massive fraud going on and all these non-citizens are voting. There's no evidence of that whatsoever, but they're using that type of narrative to continue to knock down democracy. What I want to say, the last thing, is that I do have hope. Some of this stuff keeps me up at night because I work in the democracy space, but there's a lot of people talking about what we want on the other side of this, and it looks way better than what it is now. And that gives me a lot of hope. There's a lot of people working behind the scenes to make things different, and that gives me a lot of hope.
I love that. And that's a perfect segue, because what we wanted to do now is talk a little bit about what are the shared principles across the different real solutions conversations that we've had. So one of the things we did this week was to look back at the transcripts of all of the conversations we've had, and especially the questions we asked you all about vision for the future and what are some of the values and principles underlying the policy that you're focused on. And then we looked across them to see what were the similarities and what were some of the synergies, so that we could start to think about what is a kind of bigger story that we can tell about that world that we're trying to build in the long run, like you were talking about, Cindy. And so one of the principles that really stood out was just that people need to be centered, and that government needs to be accessible and responsive. Sounds pretty straightforward, pretty easy to accept, and powerful in that way. But it links some interesting issues. So of course, with campaign finance, if there's public finance of campaigns, then everyday people can actually run and become leaders in government, and the trust of government, because people like everyday people are actually in government, the trust will grow. Cindy, you said in the interview that what we as a country and our democracy value, unfortunately, has been perverted beyond recognition. We need to get back to those values of fairness and representation, and the focus on the people and their wellness. And then in the episode about community crisis response, where we were talking about what are the actual needs of people in crisis, and how does a system actually respond to them in an ideal future. And Michelle, you gave a surprising answer to me. You said, I think my answer would be in different ways, in the ways that people actually need. So there is no perfect response, because there's no universal crisis. Each person's needs are different. And so the response actually needs to be centering that person's needs and being responsive to them. So we wanted to just lift that up and ask Cindy and Michelle and others, this seems like a really universal value that's present across political views and ideology. Is this what you found? And how is centering this value and this vision of government helped you make the case for policies that you're advancing?
When you look at polling, things like that, everybody believes that money has a huge influence in politics and in our elections, and they do want to address that. People are very concerned. Unfortunately, we don't have enough elected officials making it a priority. And I believe that if we go back to those values, that we want to lift up every voice, we have to address the money issue in a big way. Public funding and financing of elections is only one thing we can do. There's many things we need to do. But I believe that does go back to those core values that people want their voices heard, and they are being drowned out by special interests, billionaires, and the money in general. And we need to elect people that care about that and want to listen to people and their constituents and change policies so more voices can be heard in the system.
Yeah, and I would just add, when I think about, this idea of really centering individuals, right, in all of the things that we're trying to move forward with. We talked a lot about how the solutions need to come from the community, right? That having them come top down from government or from legislative, like we see that often doesn't work, and often is like, it depends on whoever's in office, right? We're talking about, we don't know, it'll go to this and it'll sway to the other side. And so really just, kind of getting rid of that framework and saying, okay, how do we do individual up, right? How do we do it as like the person is the expert of, their own needs, in, very, basic needs. If we come in, if I went in as a crisis worker and it was, I already know what you need. Like, I've blown rapport. I don't know what they need. Like, we may be able to say, oh, well, it looks like, you're homeless in front of this business and you've got an open bottle of Mad Dog next to you. I know what you need, right? But like, that's not actually how change works. That's not how support works. That's not what healing works. And that's not what, community-based support looks like. And so I think some of the most important things to, keep in mind is when we're looking at solutions, like, they do need to be community-based. They need to be peer-based. We need to say, how do we find out what are the actual things that an individual needs on an individual call, right? But that's asking them, figuring it out, asking the questions that will allow them to feel safe and then be able to access what is it that you actually need right now, and it may be very different than what we think that they, what we might have come in as experts and decided that they needed. It really feels like we need to look at all of what's kind of going on in that same lens, right? Like, when we talk about the world we want to create, like what would we as the community, as the peers and the all of the voices say, what do we want that, what do we think we need to focus on? What do we need to, do the next, to have the next piece of healing? Just really get rid of that writing reflex where we think, there's some government agency out there who's going to come in and tell me exactly what I need and then fix all my problems for me. And, life will be, wonderful from then on. It's like, people are their answers. I think having peers be part of community-based responders, being part of these systems, like, because then you are the community. You are the one, it's like your information is coming from those people with lived experience who understand the complexities of the situation, that it is not easy to fix. And you can actually start creating solutions that matter now.
Yeah, if I can jump in just real quick. Well, one, I want to give a shout out to all the community responder programs that are out there. We have a community responder cohort where one of our members just is about to launch her pilot program in Johnson County, Iowa. So it's working. And that goes to the thrust of this, which is like, we can't just talk about saving democracy. We have to actually demonstrate democracy is working. And we need to show it. And we need to prove it. And, for us, there's also like in the perception when we don't think people have shared values, we have shared needs. So let's focus on the needs then, because that will divulge and open up and say, oh shit, we actually have, sorry for swearing, we actually have shared values. And I think that has shown up in different ways for us. One is the banning of algorithmic price fixing software. It started off in San Francisco, then went to San Diego, then went to Berkeley, and then went to 7 other jurisdictions in other states. But now it's California law. And we just addressed the affordability crisis where corporations and tech bros are trying to raise your rent and kick you out of your house. And government stepped in and said, no, not on our watch. Our priority is to keep you housed. And that's the kind of like trajectory that we can say, look, it starts from the ground and goes all the way to the state. And maybe we'll see, maybe in a decade, it'll be federal law. And I think in other places where perhaps we see unlikely allies, the work that we've been doing around automatic license plate readers, which intersects with immigration rights, abortion rights, trans rights, this data company, these tech bros are all connected and financing all these things, but they're violating our privacy. And one example of that is this program ended in Nashville when our member there sided with the right-wing libertarian people who also didn't want to have their privacy violated. And that contract ended. And it's those examples that can be replicated in places like Nashville, but also can be done in Austin, in Eugene, Oregon, in Denver, that we need to say, hey, we want to protect your privacy. We want to keep you in your home. We want genuine public safety that doesn't kill people, but treats people with the mental health response, with the drug policy response that they need, and actually improving the quality of life of all people. And so we need to demonstrate that democracy does work and that it's worth saving, because just saying it is not going to be enough. We actually have to prove it.
It's great to hear about all these examples around the country. Those are they're so practical in real life. They give hope for sure, especially these unexpected places that don't get the attention they deserve. So another one of the narratives that was sort of cross-cutting when we looked at how everybody was talking about real solutions was that there's a kind of freedom that comes about when people's real problems are solved by these solutions that allows people to thrive in a really meaningful way. And so when we were talking about baby bonds, Amit and David spoke to this in really powerful ways. Amit, you said we can interrupt these cycles of poverty in a way that not only will help people lead these economically independent and secure lives, but achieve true freedom. And then in the social housing episode, Fair said something similar. He said, having a stable home can open up so many opportunities, right? Like the ability to be able to imagine and pursue a passion or an interest when you don't have to be so concentrated on your housing costs. And so this kind of thriving, like good living that is made possible, and the freedom to just kind of have the space and time to dream a little bit and do something that you're called to do. But that's a really different version of freedom than we often hear. And this country has had so many different versions of freedom, and some of them have been so harmful. And so I'm curious how you all see that resonating or not, and what it looks like when you're kind of speaking about your policies through that lens. Amit, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. Yeah. For us, and our organization runs cash transfer programs, structured in various ways, but they're fundamentally cash transfer programs. So for us, when we're talking with folks about their definitions of freedom, we're finding it's often very practical. It's about whether you have choice and agency in your life. Can you say no to a bad job? Can you afford to stay in your home? Can you start that small business without fear of maybe a little setback wiping you out? And when we are talking with the participants we serve about freedom that way, and really when they're describing freedom to us, they're recognizing what freedom is because they know what it's like to not have it. If you don't have capital or savings or assets, we're finding that choices are mostly theoretical. So for us, the narratives that we're uplifting are around freedom, being about having the tools to exercise agency. So for example, in our program, when folks hear about stories of the young adults in our baby bonds program, they're going to hear that folks are able to start businesses and buy a home and invest in their community because they have access to meaningful capital. We want for folks to understand that this was not a capability question or anything related to personal deficits. This was simply about resources and folks then being enabled to pursue freedom. So for us, when we're thinking about reclaiming this notion of freedom, it's really about asking who gets to be free in this economy and why. And freedom ought to be less of a slogan and really more of a standard to measure policy against. We need to move away. We often talk about freedom from, but we ought to be talking about the freedom to be able to pursue your dreams, aspirations, and whatnot. And to get at that from our perspective, a starting point and a foundation is quite practical. It's about resources, which enables freedom.
Anybody else want to speak to that?
I can jump in. I'd like to pick up on something my colleague Fernanda said during the social housing episode, and this idea of secure housing opening up futures that are closed when you're so focused on, working yourself to the bone to make rent or living under the constant threat of eviction. It's very hard to think about, much less build a future in a place when you don't know if you're going to be there. And one of the most consistent findings in the research on social economic development is that once people have security of place, it unlocks all kinds of possibilities, right? We talk about wanting people to spend more time with their kids. We talk about people wanting to give to their communities. If you're commuting hours for work because you can't afford to live where you work, if you're working 2 to 3 jobs, if all of these conditions which insecure housing produce, which in addition to just the impact they have on habitability and the housing itself, it has an incredible negative impact on the kinds of freedoms that we're talking about. Freedom to, again, be involved in the community, be involved in your kids' lives, to plan for and build a future. So I think it's really important, whether it's housing or there are a number of other issues that speak to or that impact this issue of freedom. I think it's really important when we talk to people about these things that we reaffirm and recognize when they talk about these conditions, that one, they make it very hard not only to survive in the present, but to build a future. And I think, once people lose hope in there being a future that they can be excited about, it forecloses all kinds of possibilities in the present. And so that idea of kind of liberating the future has so much to do with addressing economic inequality in the present.
Truly, in addition to being real policy solutions, it's really work of the heart and the mind. You know what I mean? It's like, how do we one, build the empathy so those who have the privilege and the freedom as it was defined to do all these other things also can bridge across and say everyone is worthy of that same dignity and joy, right? And it's going to look differently. And I think the hard part about policy, it's that, in my opinion, is that it tries to substantiate something that is so intangible. And I think that's the work at hand. So just another little reminder of thank y'all for doing the work that you are doing. And now I think with this episode, there's a cool thing that there's somewhat of a shared, folks who are doing this together in different aspects and different parts of policies that are all sort of striving towards building this different type of world and way of relating to one another. So yeah, just wanted to share that.
Wanted to lift up one of the other values that was cross-cutting, that was evident in the narratives that folks had across the different episodes, which was that we have shared fates, that people are interdependent as much as we like to think we're not. And so Moira, in the episode on disaster response, you said our fates are shared. particularly when we're talking about these extreme weather disasters that climate change is making more severe and more frequent. And it's also interesting because this actually connects directly to good insurance design. Good insurance design requires pulling together a ton of different policyholders and different exposures to types and levels and timelines and geographies of risk. So actually the best insurance policy is diverse in those ways and brings us all together into a community of shared fate. And then Christina on the wealth tax episode said something a little bit similar. She said, we all have a desire to care for one another and to belong in a group together. And that should and can actually build an economy that doesn't just embrace individuality and competition, but actually gives us a sense of our shared destiny, and that our tax system should really follow that same framework. And so there's this kind of deep level of interdependence, but then you both really connected it to how actually policy can reflect that value that we hold. And so I'm curious if Moira and others, if you could speak to how it goes when you're lifting up this interdependence and this narrative of shared fate.
In disaster, it's some of the hardest time in people's lives, and also it's a time when people show up for each other. I mean, think about all of the food drives and the neighbors showing up when, people's houses are burned down or flooded or what have you, or think about what's happening in Minneapolis. And, the vast majority of us show up for each other when our friends and family in our community are in need, right? And that there is that innate understanding of our interconnectedness that I think the vast majority of us have. And so I think we really can and should tap into that and build on that and be inspired by that when we're doing policy work. And of course, central to that is kicking back to one of the earlier pieces of the conversation, right? About how people being the center of policy design, right? An example of this in the work that I've done in the home insurance world, there's been a lot of policy proposals that basically seem to have as the goal, let's rescue the insurance industry. And my colleagues and I are like, no, that is not the goal that we want. The goal should be ensuring safe and affordable housing for people, right? And maybe insurance has a role in that, sure, as do other policy tools, but like the goal is the people, right? And, and I really think that this centering of people's well-being requires accounting for all the ways that our lives are intertwined with each other and with the natural world. Right. And as you referenced in that earlier conversation, Eli, particularly when we're talking about some of these things like climate disasters that are not caused by individuals and are not born just by individuals, there's a collective responsibility to respond and to prevent more harm. And I'm hearing that same sort of ethos in so much of what others are saying, right? We're all asking questions like, how are we building institutions that work for all of us? How are we increasing the availability and the affordability of things that we all need for a good life, right? There's this solidarity piece that is a thread in so much of what folks are talking about. And I think when it comes to making policy, that needs to be part of how we're defining the goal, as I was just saying, and also a question that we continue to ask as we think about every single detail of the policy, right? Because you might end up with a thread that actually just reinforces that individualism. And so I think we need to kind of keep going back and asking ourselves that question. Is this really centering people? Is this really about well-being for all of us at every level of the policy conversation?
I'm always reminded when thinking about shared fate of this great hope that I had when the pandemic hit, that our experiences of it would shift Richard's laughing because they've heard me say this multiple times, but I just thought that we were going to collectively across society learn once and for all about our interdependence, that, if my grocery clerk is sick and can't get paid time off, then that actually makes me more likely to get sick. And so we should actually stand up for each other. But there's this constant kind of forgetting of what we've actually experienced and actually witnessed. And so I'm just reminded of how much these narratives are part of that kind of struggle to actually just not forget what we've lived through.
I'm laughing for many reasons. I'm laughing because, and to Ivan's point, I'm like, excuse your French, excuse mine. I'm like, I think after pandemic, I was like, ay, people están bien pendejos. I feel like that's where I learned that I like people, but I don't know if I like humanity. And then that's also where I realized that cities were probably our greatest mistake as the civilization, because I feel like we did see the interdependence, but I saw it on my block. I saw it on the radius of my community. I saw it in families and in networks and in social systems talking to one another and not sort of interdepending on one sort of super system like the European Union or the American Empire. Like, I mean, there was just a different way to relating, but we didn't see it or had never experienced it in that way that we were then able to scale it. So I think it's there. But it's just kind of thinking about that fine line of what at what scale, and here in Los Angeles, we've tried it a couple of ways with neighborhood councils, for example, as a system, as an advisory board or whatever that then gives to the city council. So they think that the hard question, as I kind of transition us in a very, very dark way to the last question of what is that special sauce in that right homeostasis of ingredients to kind of get us to a scale where it is possible, where it is normalized, where there is an opportunity to be interdependent on one another. And I think that there's echoes of those things around us. We just haven't necessarily all leaned into it, or are still sort of battling to do that paradigm shifting in some stubborn heads. And with that, I'm curious to kind of wrap us up in thinking a little bit about, so what are the institutions that need to be designed? And I think we started talking about this in some ways as the federal administration has dismantled very white cloth a bunch of agencies across the federal government, and also by getting rid of 10% of the federal workforce. There's now going to be this gaping hole in sort of the type of capacity that the government has and whatever a future administration has to rebuild. And so I guess that leaves us with an opportunity and asks us to wonder, well, what does that mean for real solutions? And how could the proposed policies or additional policies help us design these new future institutions and programs?
I would love to just jump in and bring it to like kind of tie it into what we were just talking about, where it's just like in most of the situations that have been, community tragedies or community felt experiences, like the community, we do see this sense of interdependence, and we see this broadening of, we are all part of this one experience and this one thing. And, I just need to name like the systems that are in place love to quickly divide out from that space and start telling it, oh, no, you're special. You're special. Your experience was more special. Your experience is different than what their experience was. And so slowly we start to build out from that. And so I think at, the root of even this question of moving forward, it's like, how do we keep ourselves like seeing the common humanity and being like, yes, we're all special. And we all have this, this communal interdependence that really relies on each other in all of these really similar ways. So how do we always keep coming back to that framework with people to remind them when there's all these other sources that are trying to tell us a different story?
One thing that I always think about is we cannot be protecting institutions to save democracy. In some ways, the protection of institutions will get us farther away from democracy. And what we need to know is like, are these structures actually addressing the needs, the wants, the dreams of our communities? And if they're not, we should actually take the learning and say, we need to dismantle and rebuild. And one example of that is Portland, Oregon was a city commission government. It was each random commissioner was a head of an agency and wasn't really reflective and didn't represent the whole city, didn't provide enough representation, especially for BIPOC folks. And they came with a proposal. All the city voted to completely redo their form of government. And now they have more city council members that represent different communities. They have a mayor that actually oversees and administers city agencies. And like some people would be like, it's a little clunky, it's not working. It's like, but is it better than it was before? And they're like, oh yeah, 100 times. I can actually talk to my council member. I actually know who the mayor is. I also know who runs the agencies. And I also know who is supposed to be held accountable, but I also know roles and responsibilities. And I know how I can play my role in that. And so really making sure that we do not go back to the status quo. I think, Cindy, it was you who said it, that like, if we're going to come back and be like, guess what? We're going back to the way it was. People are like, we don't want that either. Like, what? And so we have to remember that there are those voters that were AOC Trump voters. People are looking for disruptors, but we need to give them actual solutions that improve their lives, not just burn things down and dismantle and put them out on the street. And so looking at our institutions, being honest and blunt with ourselves of what is not working and what we actually have to dismantle and what do we actually have to improve and what do we actually have to build that is new and different, that directly addresses the needs of our communities. I'm also like an Angelino. Our homelessness issue is embarrassing. It's criminal. It is all those things. And if those systems that we have in place are not addressing the issue, guess what? We need to break that down, come up with something else. There's enough practices out there, and we cannot have it be a one size fits all. What works for Austin, it's not going to be the same that's going to work for St. Louis, Missouri. So we also have to know that we have to adapt. We have to listen to folks and actually know how it should work in that specific area. But let's not hold ourselves to institutions. Let's hold ourselves to true democracy, and let's hold to our people.
I'm just going to jump in. Ivan, I'm so glad you brought up Portland, Oregon, because that's a proportional representation type system that many other governments across the world have adopted. We're one of the last democracies to adopt like that. So it's exciting to see what's going on in Portland. And those are the type of reforms that we really want to push. But one thing I want to end with is that all real systemic change has happened started on the local level. Started with small groups, individuals coming together to go, how do we want to solve these problems in our community? And it's grown out of that. If you look at history, systemic changes have always started usually on the local level. And I think many people don't feel like they have any power to change anything, but it's just not true. If you look at how communities have responded to ICE in LA, in Portland, Oregon, in Minneapolis, communities have come together and they push back against what's going on. And I think that's the kind of energy we need to change our system, whether it's moving to a proportional system, addressing money in elections, enabling people to push through reforms that actually have meaning in people's lives. We have the power to do that. And I think we need to find ways that we can show people the kind of power that they really have. And it usually always starts at the local level.
I'll just jump in real quick on the point Cindy was making, which I think is such a great one to close on about local. Certainly no one wishes for repression, but the thing is, when it happens, you sometimes see that's when some of the most amazing experiments in freedom happen under the conditions of that kind of pressure. And certainly not the whole country is experiencing what places like what Minneapolis and St. Paul are experiencing. We're all experiencing some level of pressure. And so my hope is that certainly at the local level that we pay attention to and capture these lessons that are occurring, or these expressions, these experiments that are happening under conditions of repression, and see them as the seeds of building better institutions in the future. I just got this thing from someone on the ground in Minneapolis. I'll just read it. It's very quick. And they write, one of the things about organizing the Twin Cities right now is that even the most long-term organizers who've been here for decades can't keep track of all the resistance that is going on. There are so many self-organized crews just doing work that in any conversation with someone from another neighborhood, you might stumble over a whole collective of people resisting in ways you didn't think of. There's a crew of carpenters just going around fixing kicked-in doors. There are tow truck drivers taking cars of detained people away for free, people delivering food to families in hiding. So many local rapid response groups that the number is uncertain, but somewhere between 80 and the low hundreds. people standing watch outside daycare centers and schools, right? So people are creating solutions to problems locally. And because it's under conditions of repression, the lessons are a little bit clearer to see, because if things are more extreme. The repression is extreme, but the community responses are extreme in the sense of really pointing a way forward. So I hope once we get through this very difficult period, that we learn from those and build our new institutions on the basis of those real things that people did and are doing and will do.
Thank you all so much for joining us in this conversation. And I think very much, even aside all the dark humor, I do have hope. I do have a lot of hope, and what a blessing that we do also get to be advancing policies while also taking the time to like show up in communities, whether that's with our neighbors, whether that's with our local officials, whatever ways that it is. I feel one thing that I am taking with me from this series is that all of our speakers are showing up and showing out through the thinking and designing and strategizing that we are doing. And so for that, I'm also grateful. Thank you all to the listeners who have been part of this journey, 8 episodes deep. I'm hoping, listen, my big takeaway from this is that we need like a project belonging. I don't know what that means. I don't know who's going to be in it. I don't know who's going to fund it, but maybe that's what we'll do, and like get our heads together and put our own policy agendas out there.